Captain Elijah Carter had always felt at home in the sky. Since childhood, he had dreamed of commanding aircraft, soaring through endless horizons, defying gravity and breaking barriers. His passion for flying was sparked by stories of his father, a pilot who had navigated the skies during difficult times, paving the way for those who dared to follow. On this particular morning, the air was crisp, the airport bustling with its usual mix of travelers and crew members hurrying to their destinations. Elijah walked confidently through the terminal, his uniform a symbol of years of dedication and expertise. He was scheduled to pilot Flight 362, a route he had flown countless times before. But today, fate had something else in store for him, something that would shake the foundations of everything he believed in. As he moved through the terminal, the hum of boarding announcements blended with the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases. Amid the crowd, he spotted Natalie Hayes, a familiar and trusted colleague. Her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to fairness had earned her deep respect among the crew. They exchanged a brief but knowing glance, a silent promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. At the check-in counter, where passengers and crew shuffled through their routine procedures, Elijah was abruptly stopped. A voice, cold and unwavering, cut through the morning air. "Captain Carter, you will not be flying this aircraft today. Please take a seat in economy." For a moment, he thought he had misheard. "Excuse me?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice steady despite the storm of disbelief building inside him. "Your seat has been reassigned. You'll be flying as a passenger today." The words landed like a blow. Years of training, thousands of hours in the cockpit, and the responsibility he carried for every flight, dismissed in an instant. He had worked tirelessly to earn his title, only to be told that it could be taken away without explanation. Elijah took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm. "Is this how this airline values experience?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. The response was devoid of emotion. A vague explanation about protocol adjustments was given, but it was clear. This wasn't about qualifications. It was about something deeper, something unspoken but painfully familiar. As he stepped back, whispers spread among the nearby passengers. Some murmured in confusion, others in outrage. Across the aisle, Ryan Mitchell, the co-pilot for the flight, watched in silent conflict. His face betrayed an internal battle, a recognition of the injustice unfolding before him. Yet fear kept him frozen. He knew speaking up could cost him, but saying nothing made him complicit. Through the growing tension, Natalie stepped forward, her expression firm with quiet determination. "Elijah," she said softly, so only he could hear, "this isn't right. You've earned that seat. You deserve more than this. We need to push back." Her words carried a quiet strength, offering a flicker of hope in a moment clouded by discrimination. Yet Elijah knew this battle wouldn't be won in a single conversation. The system they were up against was built on old prejudices, hidden behind policies and unchallenged traditions. Still, he wasn't one to back down. With every step toward the aircraft, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This was more than just a flight. It was a fight for respect, for recognition, for the right to exist in spaces he had worked so hard to reach. His father had told him stories of struggle and resilience, of pushing forward even when the odds were stacked against him. And now, Elijah found himself at the heart of his own battle. As he climbed the stairs into the plane, he made a silent vow. He would not let this injustice go unanswered. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. The hum of the engines was drowned out by the hushed conversations among passengers who had witnessed the scene. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their hesitation evident. They had seen what had happened, but, like Ryan, fear kept them silent. Settling into his economy seat, Elijah looked out the window. The sky stretched endlessly before him, a stark contrast to the confines of the cabin, where human prejudice still dictated who belonged where. As the plane took off, the realization settled deep in his chest. The battle he faced wasn't just about one flight or one unjust decision. It was about an entire system that still placed barriers in front of people like him. And he wasn't going to stay silent. From his cramped seat in economy, Elijah Carter gazed out at the endless stretch of blue sky. The irony was impossible to ignore. While the heavens remained limitless, human prejudice had imposed the tightest of constraints. The space between him and the cockpit was more than just physical. It symbolized something far greater. A divide rooted not in ability, but in perception. A divide that had tried, time and again, to devalue talent and dismiss worth based solely on outward appearance. Within the cabin, the murmurs of disbelief from earlier had begun to shift. What had started as hushed whispers of shock had evolved into quiet, yet firm expressions of dissent. Groups of passengers leaned in toward one another, their voices low but filled with a growing urgency. They weren't just discussing a single unfortunate incident anymore. They were questioning whether this was part of something much larger, evidence of a system that needed to change. Every hushed conversation carried an unspoken promise. This moment would not be ignored. Meanwhile, Elijah sat still, gripping the armrest, his mind flickering between the triumphs of his career and the raw sting of the humiliation he now faced. He thought of the countless flights he had piloted, the turbulent skies he had navigated with precision, the lives he had safely guided to their destinations. And yet, here he was, stripped of his rightful place in the cockpit, reduced to a silent observer in the very space he had mastered. It wasn't just about where he sat. It was about the unspoken message that his years of dedication could be erased with a single, unjust order. Across the aisle, Ryan Mitchell, the co-pilot, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His fingers drummed against the armrest, his gaze flitting between the instrument panel and the tense scene unfolding in the cabin. Once, he had believed in the fairness of aviation, that hard work, discipline, and skill determined a pilot's place in the industry. But now, watching Elijah relegated to a cramped economy seat for no reason other than bias, he saw the truth more clearly than ever. No matter how skilled, no matter how accomplished, prejudice could still clip the wings of those who had earned the right to soar. And yet fear kept him silent. He wanted to speak up, to challenge what was happening. But the weight of potential consequences pressed down on him like the force of heavy turbulence. Would standing up cost him his career? Would speaking the truth shatter everything he had worked for? As Ryan wrestled with his own conscience, another figure in the economy cabin had already decided that silence was no longer an option. Isaac Bennett, a middle-aged man with wise eyes and a steady voice, leaned toward Elijah. "Captain," he said, his tone both respectful and reassuring, "your legacy isn't defined by where you sit today. It's defined by the lives you've touched, by the excellence you've demonstrated time and time again. Don't let this moment take that away from you." His words were simple, but they carried immense weight. Something inside Elijah stirred. For a brief moment, the ember of humiliation that had burned inside him was fanned into something else entirely: defiance. No arbitrary order, no misplaced bias, no systemic injustice would ever extinguish his light. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin transformed into something new. A quiet revolution began to take shape in the most unassuming of places, between the cramped rows of economy seats, among strangers who found themselves united by a shared sense of right and wrong. Passengers passed discreet notes to one another, offering words of solidarity. Some exchanged knowing glances, silent acknowledgments that this moment had struck a deeper nerve than any of them had anticipated. And just like that, Elijah's personal battle became something greater. It became a symbol of resistance, a call for justice that would extend far beyond the walls of this aircraft. As the hours in the air stretched on, so too did the determination of those around him. The murmurs of passengers turned into something more: stories, confessions, shared histories of discrimination and resilience. An elderly teacher recalled the many years she had spent fighting for equality in education. A young artist spoke of dreams put on hold by societal constraints. Even a businessman, typically preoccupied with profits and schedules, took a moment to share his quiet indignation at a system that valued appearances over ability. Each story added a new layer to the conversation. Each voice strengthened the quiet rebellion taking shape. And Elijah, though confined physically to a single seat in economy, found his spirit soaring higher than ever. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, he felt something stronger than anger. Hope. Because as he sat in the midst of this unexpected uprising, he realized something. This was no longer just his fight. It was a movement, one that was only just beginning. The injustice that had unfolded in the cabin was no longer just an isolated moment. It had become something bigger. As Elijah Carter sat in the narrow seat of economy, his hands gripping the armrests, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. It was a feeling he had known before, but never with such intensity. The murmurs around him had evolved. At first, it had been whispers of disbelief, soft gasps of shock. Now, the conversations were shifting into something stronger, a quiet, simmering defiance. Passengers huddled together, their voices low but determined. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore. People weren't just questioning why a decorated captain had been stripped of his rightful place. They were questioning the deeper system that had allowed this to happen. Had this been a mistake? Or was this just one more example of an industry and a world that valued appearances over ability? The realization stung, but Elijah knew one thing. This was not going to be the final word. As the engines droned on and the hum of the aircraft filled the space, his thoughts burned with determination. This day, tainted by an act of discrimination, would not define him. Instead, it would become a spark, a catalyst for change, for a fight that was long overdue. He wasn't just reclaiming his dignity for himself. He would inspire others to rise, to demand justice, to ensure that no one else would endure this kind of humiliation again. Sitting in the solitude of economy, he closed his eyes for a moment. His mind filled with memories. His first solo flight, the way his hands had trembled before steadying on the controls, the exhilaration of takeoff. He remembered the hours of meticulous training, the sacrifices, the mentors who had believed in him. Elijah had earned his place, and no arbitrary decision, no deep-seated prejudice disguised as protocol, could take that away. A few rows away, Natalie Hayes watched him closely. The flicker of fire in his eyes, the way his posture had straightened. "Elijah," she murmured, her voice soft but unyielding. "Every injustice is a spark. Today we become the flame. We must take this beyond these walls, beyond this plane. Our words, our actions, our unity have the power to ripple outward." Her words were both a reassurance and a call to arms. Even here, in a confined space at 30,000 feet, solidarity had power. The impact of her words was not lost on Ryan Mitchell, the co-pilot, who had remained silent for too long. He had watched, torn between his own fears and the undeniable truth unfolding before him. Now something shifted inside him. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah, I've spent so long letting silence protect me, but today I see it clearly. Silence only strengthens the injustice we should be fighting against. I can't stay quiet anymore." His voice trembled, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. Elijah met his gaze, and in that moment a fragile but powerful understanding passed between them. Across the aisle, an elderly gentleman, his voice carrying the weight of experience, spoke softly. "I once watched great men fall," he said, "not because they lacked strength, but because they refused to stand when it mattered most. Today let us be the ones who stand." His words carried through the cabin, subtle but undeniable, igniting something within those who listened. One of those listening was Emma Caldwell, a history professor who had spent her life studying the past, how change was made, how movements began. She reached for her notebook, her fingers moving quickly as she began documenting every whispered conversation, every stolen glance of resistance. She had studied injustice for years. Now she was witnessing it firsthand. And she knew that history only remembered those who dared to speak. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, a quiet revolution was unfolding inside its cabin. This was no longer just about a captain being forced into economy. It was about something far greater, a system that had dismissed too many for too long. And the passengers on this flight, they were no longer just witnesses. They were becoming part of the fight. Isaac Bennett leaned in once more, his voice low but unwavering. "Captain, your brilliance isn't tied to the seat you occupy," he said, his gaze steady. "It's measured by the lives you've touched, the battles you've fought, even the silent ones. Today, you remind us all that courage isn't about convenience. It's about standing firm when it matters most." His words were sincere, cutting through the tense atmosphere with quiet strength. Around them, murmured conversations were shifting into something more, a collective outcry against injustice. Then an announcement interrupted the growing storm. A robotic voice crackled over the intercom, devoid of warmth or empathy. Due to technical concerns, this flight will now make an unscheduled landing. We appreciate your cooperation." A ripple of mixed emotions spread through the cabin. Some passengers groaned, assuming it was a minor inconvenience. Others, however, sensed something more, a disruption that could serve as an opportunity. Elijah Carter sat still, his mind processing the implications. This unexpected landing could be more than just a setback. It could be the very moment he needed. A chance to confront the institution that had stripped him of his place. A chance to turn his humiliation into something greater. As the descent began, voices in the cabin grew bolder. The hush of earlier whispers gave way to open discussions. A retired engineer, his face lined with years of struggle and perseverance, spoke in a deep, reflective voice. "I remember when my work was valued for its merit, not diminished by assumptions, by prejudice. What we're witnessing now isn't an isolated event. It's a symptom of something much deeper, something that has taken root in every corner of our society." His words carried weight, built on a lifetime of experience. Passengers huddled together, debating what this unexpected landing could mean. Maybe this is more than just a technical issue. One passenger suggested in a hushed but urgent tone, "Maybe this is our opportunity. We've seen injustice firsthand, now we have a chance to demand answers." The thought sent a current of urgency through the cabin. Elijah felt it too. Even as he remained physically confined to his economy seat, his mind soared, strategizing, calculating, preparing. For years he had navigated the complexities of flight with precision, adjusting to turbulence and unexpected variables. Now, he was applying that same skill to something far greater, a fight that reached beyond the confines of this aircraft. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been told they were less than their worth. A movement, waiting to take flight. His thoughts turned to the power of documented truth, stories, evidence, action. If this moment could be recorded, if the voices in this cabin could be amplified, it could spark something unstoppable. Natalie Hayes caught his eye again, her expression firm. There was no need for words. They both knew what had to happen next. But she spoke anyway, her voice low and brimming with conviction. "Elijah," she whispered, "once we step off this plane, we make sure this doesn't end here. We take our voices beyond these walls. We demand that excellence be recognized, without bias, without prejudice. Let our story be the spark that ignites something greater." A slow nod passed between them. The plane's wheels touched down with a finality that sent a charge through the cabin. With the descent complete, the tension in the air transformed into something unbreakable. A sense of purpose, of resolve. Every passenger, every crew member had felt it. The undeniable truth that dignity could not be contained by a single directive. The unscheduled landing was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a turning point. The hum of the engines, once mere background noise, now seemed to echo like a heartbeat in unison with their collective defiance. And as the cabin doors slid open, cool air from the tarmac replacing the recycled oxygen of the plane, Elijah and his newfound allies braced themselves. Every step down that jet bridge was not just a movement toward the terminal. It was a step toward change. A step toward confronting not just the immediate injustice, but the deep-seated biases that had been left unchallenged for too long. As they emerged into the world beyond the aircraft, the quiet resistance of the flight cabin became something louder, stronger, unshakable. A movement had just begun. The energy in the terminal was electric, charged with both uncertainty and unwavering resolve. Elijah Carter stepped onto solid ground, his pulse hammering in his chest. Around him, passengers murmured among themselves, their hushed conversations woven with a growing sense of purpose. "This is our chance," he thought, his hands clenching at his sides. "Not just to speak for ourselves, but for everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or told they didn't belong." With each step away from the plane, the weight of humiliation began to shift, no longer a burden, but a weapon. What had started as a moment of injustice in the air was now becoming a movement on the ground. Passengers clustered together, their voices pivoting from outrage to strategy. "We need to document this," one person said firmly. "Every injustice, every word that was spoken, so no one can deny what happened here." "Our strength lies in our numbers," another added. "If we stand together, they can't ignore us." A spark of something deeper took root. Not just anger, but action. Even as the fluorescent lights of the terminal cast an impersonal glow over the scene, something powerful was unfolding. The injustice inflicted upon Elijah was no longer just a singular event. It had become a mirror, reflecting centuries of systemic bias and prejudice. For those who had witnessed it firsthand, the flight had become a microcosm of the world's struggles, an undeniable truth that worth was too often measured by shallow, arbitrary standards. And in that realization, something remarkable happened. A promise, spoken in hushed voices, shared in determined glances, reinforced with each nod of agreement. "We will not let this moment fade into silence," someone whispered, their voice carrying the weight of an unshakable conviction. "This is the day we refuse to bow down." It was fragile yet unbreakable, a vow that every slight, every act of discrimination would fuel the fire for change. As the crowd gradually dispersed, making their way toward security in the world beyond, Elijah hesitated. He turned, his gaze locking onto the closed aircraft door, a silent monument to the injustice that had sparked this collective awakening. Moments ago, that door had represented power wielded unfairly, authority used to diminish rather than uplift. But now it represented something else entirely, a turning point. His humiliation had not been erased, but it had transformed into fuel, into fire, into something far greater than himself. "I will make sure this day becomes the catalyst for change," he vowed, his heart pounding with fierce determination. This was no longer just about reclaiming his own dignity. It was about demanding a future where talent was recognized without bias, where no one was forced to fight for the right to exist in the spaces they had earned. The energy in the air was thick with uncertainty, but also with hope. Elijah could feel it. The echoes of struggles fought before this moment, the weight of history pressing forward, demanding that the cycle end now. Even as passengers trickled into the busy corridors of the terminal, the fire of collective resistance burned on. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. A few yards away near the boarding gate, Elijah, Natalie, Ryan, and a small but resolute group of passengers stood firm. Their whispered defiance on the plane had transformed into something louder. A storm of righteous indignation, of unshakable unity. Each of them had carried personal battles before stepping onto that aircraft, but now they carried them together. Then, from a side door, an imposing figure emerged, a man in a sharply tailored suit, his expression measured, his approach calculated. He was Mr. Whitaker, a senior representative of the airline. His presence alone made it clear that the company understood the weight of what had happened. His voice, smooth yet distant, cut through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his practiced calm barely masking his underlying unease. "I understand you have concerns that need to be addressed. Let us discuss this matter in an orderly fashion." His words were meant to pacify, to subdue. Instead, they did the opposite, because every single person standing before him had already made up their minds. This would not be another hollow apology. This would not be swept under the rug. Before anyone else could speak, Elijah stepped forward. His voice was steady, unwavering, despite the echoes of humiliation still lingering in the air. "My name is Captain Elijah Carter," he said, his words ringing out like a declaration of war. He had spent years ensuring the safety of others in the skies, and now he was about to make history on the ground. Elijah Carter stood firm, his voice steady yet laced with the weight of injustice. "I have spent my life ensuring safe passage in the skies, and today I was reduced to an economy seat, treated as though my expertise was secondary to the color of my skin." His words rang through the terminal like a challenge, impossible to ignore. "I don't just want an explanation. I demand accountability for this egregious act." The gathered crowd felt the raw truth of his statement. It wasn't just about a single flight. It was about a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, and silenced. For a fleeting moment, Mr. Whitaker, the airline senior representative, faltered. His carefully constructed expression wavered, but then, like a reflex, his polished corporate smile returned. "Captain Carter," he said smoothly, "our policies are designed to ensure that every passenger and crew member is treated with respect. I assure you that an investigation will be launched." His words were crafted to pacify, to diffuse, but Elijah knew better. Empty promises had been made before, spoken with the same measured tone, delivered with the same rehearsed calm. And yet, time after time, nothing changed. Before he could respond, Natalie Hayes stepped forward, her voice sharp but unwavering. "Respect isn't given through investigations or vague assurances," she stated. "Respect is earned by acknowledging the wrongs committed and taking real, decisive action. We are done accepting platitudes. We deserve more than apologies. We demand change." Her words cut through the air like a blade, igniting murmurs of agreement among the gathered passengers. Then, Ryan Mitchell, the co-pilot who had long remained on the sidelines, took a step forward. His voice, though softer, carried its own quiet power. "I've seen too many moments like this," he admitted, regret lacing his words. "I've stayed silent, thinking that was the safest choice. But silence has only allowed the same prejudices to thrive. Today, I refuse to be part of that cycle." His statement sent a ripple through the crowd, proof that even those who had once been afraid to speak were finding their courage. Across the gathering, Isaac Bennett and Emma Caldwell exchanged a knowing glance. They understood what was happening. This was bigger than a single confrontation. This was history unfolding in real time. Leaning in, Emma whispered, "We have to document this. Every word, every moment. If we don't, it will be too easy for them to erase it." She had spent years chronicling stories of injustice, but today, she wasn't just an observer. She was a participant, and so was everyone else in that terminal. Outside, the terminal, normally a space of fleeting connections and hurried steps, had transformed into something entirely different. People who had never met before now stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by a shared cause. Even strangers passing by found themselves stopping, drawn to the undeniable gravity of the moment. Then, from within the crowd, a new voice emerged. A middle-aged woman, Margaret Dawson, her hands trembling slightly with the weight of years of quiet suffering, stepped forward. "For too long we've been told that our pain is ours to bear alone," she said, her voice clear despite the emotion behind it. "But today, I see something different. I see a movement, a reminder that our struggles, our lives matter, and I refuse to let this moment slip away without action." Her words sent a wave of resolve through the assembled crowd. They weren't just witnesses to injustice anymore. They were part of the fight against it. As more voices joined the chorus, recounting their own experiences of being dismissed, undermined, or ignored, the terminal itself became a living testament to the power of unity. Passengers huddled in small groups, whispering plans, social media, press conferences, peaceful demonstrations, appeals to advocacy organizations. No longer just angry individuals, they were a collective force, intent on making sure the airline and the world heard them. And at the center of it all, Elijah Carter stood tall, feeling the weight of his own legacy, intertwining with the strength of those around him. This isn't just about reclaiming a seat, he thought, his heartbeat steady with renewed purpose. It's about ensuring that every person, every talented individual who has been sidelined by prejudice is given the respect they deserve. His silent vow wasn't just a promise, it was a declaration, one that would not be ignored. The group stood together once more, their resolve unshaken. Natalie Hayes turned to the crowd, her voice unwavering. "We cannot be placated by hollow words," she declared. "Our actions today, our unity in the face of discrimination, must serve as the catalyst for lasting reform. Let our voices be the hammer that shatters the barriers built by bias and indifference." Her words hung in the air, igniting nods of agreement, murmurs of determination. A symphony of silent promises spread through the crowd. This wasn't just about one man or one moment. This was about something much bigger. And then an unexpected ally emerged. A journalist, known for his fearless pursuit of truth, stepped forward. Julian Cross had built a reputation for exposing injustice, and now his sharp eyes were locked onto Elijah Carter with measured urgency. "Captain Carter," he said, his tone both respectful and insistent, "your story is one of resilience, defiance, and undeniable truth. The world needs to hear it. Allow me to document today's events, so that every injustice you've faced, every barrier you've shattered, is recorded for those who come after us." Elijah met his gaze, understanding the weight of what was being asked. This wasn't just about telling a story, it was about building a movement. As the conversation with Mr. Whitaker faded beneath the weight of shared truth and collective determination, the crowd's resolve solidified into something unstoppable. This was no longer an abstract desire for change. It was a tangible, burning force, ready to transform every instance of discrimination into a stepping stone toward a more just future. The energy in the air was thick, not with chaos, but with revolution. A revolution born not from rage, but from the steadfast belief that every human being, regardless of background, deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for their true capabilities. Elijah's chest swelled with a mix of pride and determination as he surveyed the faces around him. The quiet observer, the outspoken advocate, the hesitant bystander who had found their voice. They had all become part of something bigger. With every word spoken, with every tear shed in solidarity, the injustice of the day was no longer just a personal wound. It was a catalyst, a spark that would ignite change far beyond the confines of this terminal. Even as the crowd began to thin, some returning to their daily lives, others staying to ensure that their newfound unity was not lost, the impact of their collective stand could not be denied. Before stepping forward, Elijah paused at the threshold of the building. The cool air brushed against his skin, a reminder that every new beginning is forged in the fire of adversity. His gaze met Natalie's, whose unwavering determination mirrored his own. In that silent exchange, a vow was made. Their fight was only just beginning. The battle for dignity, for the recognition of true talent untainted by bias, was not a sprint, it was a marathon. But standing there, surrounded by a movement that had only just been born, Elijah knew one thing for certain. This day, the injustice they had endured would not be forgotten. It would serve as the foundation for a future where no individual was measured by their seat on a plane, but rather by the limitless potential of their spirit. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, a quiet revolution stirred in the hearts of those who had gathered. Tomorrow was no longer a distant dream. It was a palpable reality, shaped by every breath, every word, every determined step forward. With fire still burning in his eyes, Elijah Carter stepped into the chaotic brightness of the terminal, where conversations had shifted from murmurs of discontent to an active call for accountability. He thought back to the years of training, the discipline required to navigate crises. This, too, was a crisis. But this time, the stakes weren't just altitude and airspeed, they were identity and legacy. The weight in his chest didn't feel like burden anymore, it felt like momentum. And so his voice rose above the murmuring crowd. We deserve to be heard, to be seen, to be valued. Around him, voices from every walk of life filled the space, stories of quiet suffering, memories of long-hidden strength. Natalie stood by his side, resolute. Every time we are sidelined, she said, her tone both soft and unyielding, we lose a piece of our humanity. But today, we reclaim our dignity. And tomorrow, we reshape the narrative. Her words struck like a spark, setting fire to the hope buried within each listener. At the edge of the gathering, Julian Cross and Emma Caldwell worked feverishly, capturing every moment. Their cameras, their microphones. These were the new weapons of truth, chronicling a story that demanded to be told. A narrative of resilience, of unity, and of a fight that was far from over. History is written by those who dare to speak truth to power, Emma Caldwell whispered, her voice firm with conviction. Beside her, Isaac Bennett met her gaze and nodded, a silent pact forming between them. Outside, the city was bathed in twilight, as if the universe itself had conspired to cast light upon a truth long buried beneath years of prejudice. In quiet groups scattered throughout the terminal, individuals debated the origins of the discriminatory policies that had reduced a seasoned pilot to a passenger in his own realm. Ryan Mitchell, no longer the silent observer he had once been, spoke with newfound resolve. Our world is too complex for simplistic judgments, he argued. We must dismantle these archaic structures and rebuild our institutions on the pillars of merit and compassion. His words resonated. Mr. Whitaker's earlier assurances, polished and pacifying, now rang hollow in the ears of those who had heard them. The murmurs of distrust spread through the crowd like wildfire. In one hushed exchange, a senior airline official reluctantly admitted, "This is uncharted territory. This isn't a crisis we can simply smooth over with statements." Even within the system, cracks were forming. But for Elijah Carter, every shared story, every voice rising against injustice, only reinforced the bitter irony of the moment. He had spent a lifetime navigating storms, both in the air and in life. And yet, here he was, grounded by prejudice, not by skill or ability. He clenched his fists. I have flown through storms, both literal and metaphorical, he thought. And just like before, he knew one thing: he would not be defeated by turbulence. This moment, this humiliation, would be the fuel that ignited a movement too powerful to silence. What had begun as whispered conversations now coalesced into something more organized, more purposeful. In a quiet corner of the terminal, Elijah, Natalie, Ryan, and several others huddled together, strategizing their next steps. Ideas flowed freely. Petitions to be drafted, social media campaigns to be launched, peaceful demonstrations to be organized, regulatory bodies to be held accountable. Our voices are our strength, Natalie said, her quiet authority commanding their attention. If we stand together, we will force them to listen. Each nod, each murmur of agreement, became a building block in a movement that was swiftly growing beyond the walls of that terminal. Meanwhile, at the edge of the gathering, Julian Cross and Emma Caldwell worked feverishly, capturing every moment. Let this be the moment when silence is shattered by truth, Emma murmured, her hands steady as she recorded the unfolding events. Her resolve was matched by Isaac, who added in a low but firm voice, "Tonight, we become the voices of a silent revolution, the bearers of a truth that refuses to be obscured by the shadows of prejudice." Their words carried into the night, an unspoken vow among those who had once been strangers, now united by a common cause. As the night deepened and the terminal began to empty, small groups of supporters lingered, friends, colleagues, even bystanders who had witnessed the moment and felt moved by the unity and defiance in the air. They exchanged words, some of comfort, some of strategy, all of them pledges to keep fighting. "We must continue this fight," a woman whispered, her voice trembling with both emotion and determination. "Not just for one pilot, but for every person who has been marginalized and silenced for too long." And so a plan began to take shape. The crowd agreed to reconvene at a nearby community center, a space where their voices could be amplified beyond the confines of the terminal. There, the movement would be formalized, timelines for public rallies set, interviews with local media coordinated, a detailed dossier on airline discrimination compiled for industry regulators. Every whispered strategy, every determined exchange was steeped in urgency, fused with purpose. This was no longer just an outcry, it was the blueprint for revolution. As word spread, a local news network caught wind of the events. A reporter was quickly dispatched to the community center, broadcasting live coverage of the gathering. The cameras captured raw emotion, unwavering determination, a moment that had begun with one man's humiliation but had transformed into a movement for justice. On live television, the host echoed the familiar question, "Where are you watching from?" Within minutes, comments flooded in from across the country and beyond. People from all walks of life, students, activists, professionals, united in their support for what was unfolding. The desire for fairness, for dignity, for change. And then, standing before the cameras, Elijah Carter stepped forward. The room quieted, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. He spoke with a blend of authority and vulnerability, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of decades of dedication and sacrifice. "I stand before you as a man who has spent his life in the skies, navigating storms, both literal and figurative," he began. "But I refuse to be defined by a single act of discrimination." His words struck a chord, the weight of injustice pressing down on every listener. "Today we rise, not just for me, but for every person who has ever been made to feel less than their true worth." The room erupted in applause, and with that declaration, a movement that had begun in silence found its voice, one that would not be ignored. What had started as one man's humiliation in an economy seat had become a rallying cry for justice. Social media erupted with support, hashtags capturing the essence of the struggle. Dignity in flight, rise against prejudice, soar above. Each post, each tweet, each shared story echoed the same demand. A call for a future where talent and character were the only measures of worth. Influencers, activists, everyday citizens, they all lent their voices to the cause, sharing personal experiences of hardship and triumph, underscoring the pervasive impact of systemic bias. The narrative that had begun with a single flight had become something much bigger, a formidable force demanding accountability. In the days and weeks that followed, the airline found itself at the center of a media firestorm. Regulatory bodies launched inquiries, advocacy groups demanded answers. Industry insiders, long accustomed to ignoring diversity issues, were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that this was no longer a problem to be swept aside. It was a reckoning. Meanwhile, Elijah Carter and his allies were invited to share their stories at public forums and regulatory hearings. Each testimony added a new layer of undeniable evidence, further strengthening the case for sweeping reform. And then came the pivotal moment. Elijah stood before a panel of industry leaders and government regulators. The weight of decades of experience, of sacrifice, of injustice rested in his voice. "I have dedicated my life to ensuring that every flight is a safe journey," he began, his tone measured and resolute. "Yet today, I was forced to confront a system that values appearance over ability." A murmur rippled through the room. A system that diminishes the very essence of what it means to serve, to excel, to inspire. He took a breath, then delivered the words that would define the movement. "I stand here not only as a pilot, but as a representative of every person who has ever been told they are less than what they are. We demand change, not tomorrow, but now." The room fell silent, not in dismissal, but in the undeniable power of his truth. Beside him, Natalie Hayes took the stand, her voice clear and firm. "This is not merely a policy issue," she insisted. "This is a question of human dignity. Every time we allow discrimination to go unchecked, we deny the world the brilliance of untapped potential. We owe it to ourselves, and to future generations, to break free from these chains and build a world where everyone is truly valued." Her eloquent plea was met with thunderous applause. What had begun as one man's humiliation had become a movement too powerful to ignore. Outside the corridors of government, the momentum only grew stronger. Community meetings, peaceful protests, heartfelt vigils. What had started with Elijah Carter had ignited a flame that spread far beyond the confines of an aircraft. His story was no longer just his own. It had become a symbol, a reminder that every injustice, no matter how seemingly small, could be the catalyst for transformation. In quiet moments of solitude, Elijah often thought back to that fateful day, the moment a single act of discrimination had set off a cascade of events that would forever change his life and the lives of many others. Sometimes, under the soft glow of city lights, he would reflect on the irony of it all. "The very act that sought to diminish me," he mused, "became the spark that ignited something far greater. We are not defined by the challenges we face. We are defined by the courage with which we rise above them." His quiet reflection was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a spirit that, when united, could chart a course toward a future illuminated by justice, equality, and hope. And so, as the movement continued to grow, rooted in his resolve and nurtured by the solidarity of countless others, the legacy of that day became a beacon for the future. The story of Captain Elijah Carter, of Natalie Hayes, Ryan Mitchell, Isaac Bennett, Emma Caldwell, and all those who dared to challenge an unjust system. It would live on in the hearts and minds of those who believed that the sky was not the limit. It was only the beginning of the journey toward true freedom and recognition. Far from the storm of activism, James Carter stepped onto the polished floors of a first-class cabin. The weight of his tailored navy blue suit rested effortlessly on his shoulders, exuding quiet power and confidence. On his wrist, a discreet but undeniably expensive watch gleamed as he adjusted his cufflinks. And as he walked toward seat 2A, a window seat he had deliberately chosen, he was simply another passenger. To the outside world, he was just another man on a flight. But this was his airline, his plane. A Boeing 787 built from years of his own vision, strategy, and persistence. He had spent years building Atlantic Airways into a leading airline, yet as he settled into his seat and reached for his book, he knew anonymity was a double-edged sword. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest power of all. And tonight, someone else was about to learn that lesson. With an air of effortless confidence, Victoria Hastings stepped into the first-class cabin, clutching a designer handbag tightly against her chest. Her floral blouse, neatly tucked into pressed beige slacks, hinted at old money and privilege. Her platinum blonde bob remained perfectly in place as she surveyed the cabin, her sharp eyes scanning for something, or rather, Someone. Then she saw him. A flicker of discomfort, confusion, and something else, something unspoken, crossed her face. She hesitated, but only for a moment. Then she took another step, and another, until she was standing directly in front of him. But instead of speaking to him, she turned away. A hushed voice drifted through the air as she leaned toward a flight attendant standing nearby. "Excuse me," Victoria murmured, glancing over her shoulder at Daniel Wright before fixing a forced smile on the young blonde woman. "I think there's been a mistake." Rachel Porter, the flight attendant, frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am." Victoria's voice dipped lower, as if the subject of her concern shouldn't hear. "That man is in my seat." Rachel turned her head following Victoria's gaze. Her eyes landed on Daniel, who remained still, calm but fully aware. Rachel hesitated, glancing down at the tablet in her hands. Seat 2A, passenger, Daniel Wright. Still, something in Victoria's voice, her certainty, her quiet insistence, made Rachel hesitate. "One moment, ma'am," Rachel said. Squaring her shoulders and smoothing the creases in her uniform, she walked toward Daniel. "Sir," she said briskly, her tone shifting to authority, "I'm gonna have to ask you to move." Daniel looked up from his book slowly. His expression remained unreadable, but his dark eyes sharpened slightly. "Excuse me?" His voice was smooth, polite, controlled. Rachel cleared her throat. "It seems there was an error with the reservation. This seat is actually assigned to another passenger." A long silence stretched between them. Daniel exhaled slowly, closing his book with deliberate patience. He could feel the weight of Victoria's gaze behind him, the expectation in Rachel's stance. He tilted his head slightly. "That's strange," he mused. "My boarding pass says 2A. Are you sure there's a mistake?" Rachel hesitated. Her grip on the tablet tightened. "I believe you'd be more comfortable in a seat toward the back of first class," she said carefully. More comfortable. Daniel had heard those words before. Behind him, Victoria didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. Her purse was already resting on the seat, already claiming what she believed was hers. Daniel could have argued. He could have pulled rank, revealed exactly who he was. But instead, he let a small, knowing smile curve his lips. Without a word, he stood. Rachel visibly relaxed, as if she had expected more resistance. Victoria took a step closer, eager to claim her victory. Daniel took his time. Deliberate, slow, controlled. Adjusting his suit jacket, he pulled out his phone. A few quick taps. Message sent. Then he turned to Rachel. "Where should I sit then?" Rachel gestured toward seat 5C, further back, but still in first class. Daniel nodded, picked up his briefcase, walked away. Behind him, Victoria smiled, settling into her new seat with an air of triumph. But Daniel remained silent, unshaken. A young man beside him, no older than 25, leaned closer. His eyes flickered between Daniel and the scene that had just unfolded. "That was something," the young man muttered under his breath. Daniel glanced at him. Then, with the faintest smile, he said softly, "Patience. You'll see." 30 seconds later, everything did. Rachel was still tending to the first-class passengers when the cabin intercom crackled to life. "Rachel Porter, please report to the front of the aircraft." A ripple of confusion crossed her face, but she nodded and excused herself. Walking toward the galley, she found a man in a suit waiting for her. Thomas Everett, Regional Supervisor, Summit Airlines. Rachel blinked. "Mr. Everett?" His voice was like steel. "Step into the galley." The moment the door clicked shut, his eyes hardened. "Rachel," he said slowly, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" A cold weight settled in her stomach. "I don't understand," she stammered. Thomas pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. The color drained from her face. On the manifest, seat 2A was clearly assigned to one person. Daniel Wright. Her chest tightened. "You just asked the CEO and owner of this airline to move," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, because some entitled passenger didn't want to sit next to him. Rachel's breath caught. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Thomas cut her off. His jaw tightened. "You didn't bother to check. You just assumed he didn't belong there." Rachel's hands began to tremble. "Oh God, I swear I didn't mean." "You're done." His voice was cold. "Your employment with Summit Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came. "Hand over your badge." "Please, Mr. Everett, I." "Now." Her fingers fumbled as she unclipped her badge, placing it in his palm. Outside, the flight continued, as if nothing had happened. But for Rachel Porter, her career had just crashed before takeoff. Passengers continued to board, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just behind the curtain. But soon they would know. And Victoria Hastings, still sipping her champagne in seat 2A, was utterly oblivious to the fact that her little stunt was about to come crashing down. A few feet away, Daniel Wright remained silent, unbothered, still reading his book, because he knew humiliation was coming. And this time, it wasn't his to endure. Victoria exhaled contentedly, crossing her legs with an air of quiet triumph. She lifted her champagne flute, the delicate glass reflecting the soft glow of the cabin lights. Taking a slow sip, she savored not just the taste, but the feeling. Victory. Daniel had moved without resistance, without argument, but something about him unsettled her, the way he had smiled. Not in defeat, not in anger, but in calculated patience. Victoria forced herself to dismiss the thought. It didn't matter. She was exactly where she belonged. At the front of the cabin, Rachel Porter attempted to steady her breathing. Her hands still trembled. She had just been fired, but the reality hadn't fully hit her yet. Not until she stepped off this plane. She glanced at Victoria. This was her fault. If she had just sat where she was assigned, if she hadn't whispered in Rachel's ear, nudging her toward a mistake, none of this would have happened. Rachel clenched her jaw, and Victoria didn't even know yet. Final cabin checks, doors to automatic. The intercom crackled. The plane began to push back from the gate. The crew moved efficiently, strapping in for takeoff. Passengers adjusted their seats, turned off their devices. Victoria, relaxed and oblivious, took another sip of champagne. Then something shifted. A murmur, a whisper, a rustling of movement. From the corner of her eye, she noticed passengers turning their heads toward her. Subtle at first, then more. A woman in seat 3C leaned toward her husband, whispering. A businessman near the aisle tilted his phone slightly, reading something. Victoria frowned. The energy in the cabin had changed. A few rows back, Daniel continued reading, unbothered, waiting. And then, "Excuse me, ma'am." A soft, polite voice broke through the murmurs. Victoria turned, irritated by the interruption. A different flight attendant stood beside her, a senior crew member, clipboard in hand. Her expression was unreadable. Victoria straightened her shoulders. "What is it?" The flight attendant glanced at her clipboard. "You're listed under seat 14D, she said evenly. A chill shot through Victoria's veins. "What?" The flight attendant looked up, meeting her eyes. "Your original seat assignment. Economy class, seat 14D. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers were now openly staring. Victoria forced a light laugh. "There must be some mistake. I was upgraded." The flight attendant nodded. "Yes, that's correct. However," she flipped a page on her clipboard. "Upgrades are assigned to available seats, not seats that already belong to another passenger." Victoria's heart pounded. No, this wasn't happening. "You see," the flight attendant continued, her voice steady, "seat 2A was never unassigned. It was always Mr. Wright's seat. You weren't supposed to be placed here." Victoria gripped the armrest. The heat rose to her face, a slow, humiliating burn. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about the lie. She had claimed the seat as if it were hers, forced Daniel Wright to move, convinced Rachel Porter to enforce it. And now, everyone knew. Victoria swallowed, forcing composure. "Well, I'm already seated," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "So let's not make a big deal out of it." The flight attendant's lips twitched. "Oh, it's not a big deal at all," she said lightly. "We'll just need you to move back to 14D. Victoria's fingers dug into her slacks. "I'm in first class now," she insisted, her voice low, controlled. "That's my seat now." The flight attendant's smile remained pleasant. "Actually, ma'am, your upgrade was conditional on seat availability." Victoria clenched her jaw. "I'm not moving." A beat of silence. Then a deep, calm voice, measured, powerful, impossible to ignore. "You don't really have a choice." Victoria's breath caught. She turned toward him. Daniel Wright. Still seated, still relaxed, still composed. But his eyes, sharp, intelligent, waiting, were locked onto hers. He had been waiting for this. From the galley, Rachel Porter watched with quiet satisfaction. The flight attendant didn't waver. "Ma'am, please collect your belongings." Victoria's hands trembled. Passengers watched with unveiled amusement. Some had their phones raised slightly, pretending to check messages. But everyone knew what was happening. Victoria, humiliated, exposed, trapped, slowly she stood. She had no choice. And as she stepped away, she didn't dare look at Daniel. She didn't dare look at anyone. The walk down the aisle felt like an eternity. As Victoria Hastings moved past first-class passengers, their gazes lingered on her, silent yet heavy with judgment. No words, no sympathy. Only the unmistakable awareness of what had just happened. And then the sharp contrast. The narrower seats, the cramped space, no leather cushions, no champagne flute waiting on her tray. And then, seat 14D, a middle seat. She sank into it stiffly, her back rigid, her body uncomfortably wedged between two strangers. The man in 14E spared her a glance, then turned away, unimpressed. The woman in 14C didn't even acknowledge her. Here, she was nobody. The cabin doors shut. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. Victoria stared straight ahead, hands clasped in her lap, her face burning. A few rows away, Daniel Wright turned the page of his book. A quiet, satisfied smile on his lips. Even now, Victoria could feel it, the ghost of luxury, the trace of privilege, the echo of her imagined superiority. But it was gone now. And the cabin knew. A murmur passed through the passengers. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable. Chuckles, whispers, sideways glances. Not everyone knew exactly what had happened. But enough did. 2 rows ahead, a woman leaned toward her husband, her voice low, but just loud enough to be heard. She really thought she could just take his seat, the husband smirked. And now look at her, stuck in the middle seat. Victoria's face burned hotter, her fists clenched. She forced herself to stare straight ahead. Ignore them. Ignore them. Ignore them. But the comments didn't stop. A man across the aisle, pretending to scroll through his phone, spoke casually. Wild how some people act when they think no one's watching. Victoria's nails dug into her palms. Her jaw tightened. Then, the worst sound imaginable. A camera shutter. Her stomach plummeted. She whipped her head toward the sound. A teenager in 16A had her phone raised, angled perfectly, capturing Victoria's humiliation. The girl smirked. Smile, she whispered. Victoria's blood ran cold. The girl turned back to her friend, both of them giggling softly, their fingers flying over their screens. Victoria's breath caught. No. No, no, no. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was about to become a story. A few rows away, Daniel Wright remained as he had been. Calm, focused, unbothered. He hadn't spoken a word to her since she was sent to economy, because he didn't need to. The damage was already done. The plane lifted off, but Victoria's stomach remained somewhere on the ground. Then, a notification sound. A woman in 17B let out a soft gasp. Oh my God. She nudged her seatmate. It's already online. Victoria's throat tightened. Her head snapped toward the woman's phone. And there it was. A post on Twitter. A picture of her, sitting stiffly in 40D. The caption, a woman tried to take a black CEO's first-class seat and got sent to economy. The entitlement is crazy. Daniel Wright, justice served. Comments were flooding in. She thought she was slick. Not just racism, but bold racism. Daniel Wright is a legend for handling it like a boss. Look at her face. She's furious. Victoria's vision blurred. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just humiliation. This was public execution. And it was just beginning. Victoria snatched her phone from her purse. Her fingers trembled as she tapped at the screen. No service. Of course. They were still in the air. She was trapped. No way to explain herself. No way to stop it. You're trending. A few rows away, the young man sitting next to Daniel turned slightly. Mr. Wright? He murmured. Daniel looked up. Yes? The young man smirked, tilting his phone toward him. You're trending. Daniel's lips twitched. He glanced at the screen. The tweet had already hit 10,000 likes. He simply nodded. The young man chuckled. You're really not going to say anything about it? Daniel turned another page in his book. I don't need to. Victoria sat rigid, her hands still folded in her lap, her nails dug into her palms. Every second that passed, the humiliation deepened. The whispers, the glances, the camera shutters. And the presence of Daniel Wright, utterly unshaken. This was her worst nightmare. She had thought she was better. She had thought she had won. And now, she was nothing more than a joke, a cautionary tale, a lesson in karma. The flight dragged on. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it again. The chuckles, the notifications, the relentless whispers of her downfall. By the time the plane finally landed, Victoria Hastings no longer existed. At least, not in the way she had before. She had lost. And Daniel Wright stepped off the plane as he had stepped on. With quiet power, with absolute control. and without ever raising his voice. Victoria walked stiffly through Westport International Airport, her hands gripping her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. The whispers followed her. A businessman passed by, his gaze flickering to her before shaking his head. A low voice near security. "Hey." A man nudged his friend. "It's her." Victoria's breath hitched. Her hands trembled. She kept walking, kept her head down, because there was nowhere left to hide. Unlike Victoria, Daniel Wright walked out of the gate effortlessly, no tension in his shoulders, no weight dragging him down, because he had nothing to run from. A black SUV waited for him outside. The driver, a young woman in a sharp navy suit, greeted him with a nod. "Good evening, Mr. Wright." Daniel returned the nod. "Good evening." As he slid into the back seat, his phone buzzed, a message from his chief communications officer. "Trending at number 1. Do you want to release a statement?" Daniel stared at the message for a second. Then he typed back, "No. Let them talk." He leaned back, gazing out the window. Justice had already been served, and he hadn't needed to say a single word. In a small fluorescent-lit office inside the Westport International Airport employee wing, Anna Caldwell sat, her uniform still on but her badge was gone. The HR representative folded her hands neatly. "I hope you understand," she said carefully, "why your employment has been terminated." Anna swallowed, her throat dry. "I do." A beat of silence. Then, "You should also know," the HR rep continued, "Mr. Wright has instructed us to conduct a full review of passenger treatment policies." Anna looked up sharply. "What?" The woman's expression remained neutral. "This wasn't just about one incident. We've received other complaints about how certain passengers are treated." Anna's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about Daniel Wright. It was about her, her pattern, her bias, and now there was no undoing it. By the time Victoria finally turned her phone back on, it was too late. The damage was done. The first notification hit instantly. "Your name is all over Twitter. What did you do?" Then another. "Call me ASAP. It's everywhere." Her fingers trembled as she opened her browser. And there it was. Her face. Captured from every angle. Dozens of versions, memes, screenshots, videos. The headline that haunted her. "This lady thought she could steal a CEO's first-class seat and get away with it." The captions burned into her mind. White privilege at its finest. Look at her face when she realized the walk of shame to economy. Her breath turned shallow. She scrolled faster. But it wasn't just Twitter. It was on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, everywhere. And then her phone rang. Her boss. She froze. She already knew what this call meant. Still, she answered. "Victoria?" His voice was sharp, cold. "We need to talk." Her vision blurred. Everything was falling apart, and it had all started with a single choice. One seat, one assumption, one moment of arrogance. Now, she was paying the price. That night, Daniel Wright sat in his penthouse in the city, sipping a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed again. Everett Airline stock is up 4%. A soft, amused smile touched his lips. He set the glass down, staring out at the city skyline. This had never been about revenge. It was about principle. And now the world had learned exactly who he was. And more importantly, who he wasn't. He wasn't a man to be underestimated. He wasn't a man to be disrespected, and he sure as hell wasn't a man to be moved. Victoria Hastings sat in her darkened living room staring at the screen. She had barely left her house since the incident. Every time she did, she felt the eyes, the stares, the judgment. She had tried to fight it at first, tried to explain, but no one wanted to listen. The internet had already decided, and once the internet decides, there is no undoing it. Her job had let her go. The official reason? Not a good fit for company values. Her social circle went silent. Even her closest friends had stopped returning her calls, because no one wanted to be associated with her. She had become a pariah, and Daniel Wright, untouchable. Everywhere she looked, there were articles praising him. Daniel Wright shows grace under pressure. Everett Airlines CEO demonstrates true leadership. The power of dignity, how one man handled discrimination without a single outburst. Victoria's fists clenched. It's not fair. It's not fair. She wasn't a bad person. She had just... Her thoughts trailed off. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She had done this to herself, and now, she had to live with it. Anna never thought she'd be jobless at 38. She had worked in aviation for over a decade. But now no airline would touch her. Her name had become toxic in the industry. The aviation world was smaller than people thought, and when a CEO personally fires you, it follows you. Anna sat in front of her laptop, scrolling through rejection emails. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with other candidates. Unfortunately, we will not be proceeding with your application. Her throat tightened. She thought about reaching out to Daniel, apologizing, asking for a second chance. But what would she even say? I didn't know who you were. Would that make it better? No. So instead, she shut her laptop and faced the reality. She had ruined her own career, and no one was going to fix it for her. Anna Caldwell sat in front of her laptop, the screen glowing in the dimly lit room. Her inbox was a graveyard of rejection emails. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with other candidates. Unfortunately, at this time, we will not be proceeding with your application. One after another, each one a confirmation of what she already knew. Her career in aviation was over. The industry was small, and when a CEO personally fires you, it follows you. Anna's throat tightened. She considered reaching out to Daniel Wright, maybe an apology, a plea for a second chance. But what would she even say? I didn't know who you were? Would that make it better? No. So instead, she shut her laptop and faced the reality. She had ruined her own career, and no one was going to fix it for her. Victoria Hastings was unofficially blacklisted, not just from her former employer, but from several companies. The official reason? Public controversy. The real reason? No one wanted to be associated with her. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her emails were ignored. Her social circle gone. Victoria had always been somebody. Now she was nobody. And worst of all, she had done this to herself. Daniel Wright sat in his executive office, high above downtown. A fresh cup of coffee sat beside him, untouched. A knock at the door. His assistant stepped inside. Mr. Wright, I have the final report on the incident. Daniel didn't look up. Summarize it for me. His assistant flipped through her notes. Anna Caldwell has been permanently terminated. Victoria Hastings, well, she's been unofficially blacklisted from several companies. Daniel simply nodded. And public reaction? His assistant smirked. Overwhelmingly in your favor. People admire how you handled it. Some are even calling it a masterclass in grace under pressure. Daniel finally looked up, an amused smile playing on his lips. A masterclass, huh? His assistant shrugged. That's what they're saying. Daniel leaned back in his chair. He had never wanted revenge, had never needed to fight back with anger or words, because real power isn't about proving a point. It's about knowing who you are and letting the world see for itself. Let's move on, he said finally. His assistant nodded. Of course, sir. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee. Outside, the city stretched beneath him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt nothing but peace. Because in the end, justice had already been served, and he had never even needed to lift a finger.